Welcome back to the show. Ted Ramey with you on this Tuesday afternoon. And coming up Wednesday, after the Warriors and Heat game, basketball guru, the Pete Newell story, is going to be making its debut on Comcast Sportsnet Bay Area, a 90-minute documentary about, of course, the Hall of Fame basketball coach. And we have the director and producer of basketball guru, the Pete Newell story, Doug Harris, joining us right now. Doug, how you doing today, man?
Oh, I'm doing real good.
Appreciate you coming on, man. You know, it's amazing because I've talked to some people when I was telling that you were coming on to talk about this documentary. You know, I got some friends who are, we're relatively young, but a lot of people, and my dad always made me aware, but a lot of people just kind of, they hear the name, the Newell Classic, and that's kind of where their knowledge ends. They don't realize just the incredible impact on the basketball world this guy had.
No, they don't. And, a lot of younger people, they reference Pete Newell through his big man's camp because, during the 90s and the early 2000s, he had most of the greatest frontline players, to play in the NBA during those eras, participating every summer in his Pete Newell's big man's camp.
Yeah, no, it's just absolutely amazing to look at some of the people that he's worked with and the things that he's able to do over his career. So I guess what was it that got you going with the documentary, looking with him in particular, and what are some of the things that people can look for in this film?
Well, the film started off as a project that I was doing, was a short documentary about the anniversary of USF's back-to-back championships. Mm-hmm. And, when you go into these documentaries, you want to start off with the history of how the winning tradition all started at USF. And all fingers point to Pete Newell back in 1949 when he won the NIT. And so I interviewed Pete Newell to get a little early history about USF prior to, the 50s championships with Bill Russell and Casey Jones. Mm-hmm. And I let Pete Newell just talk. I just let him talk. And then as he was talking, I was like, wow, this is like the history of basketball. And I asked him if he had a documentary, because I'd like to, see it. And he told me he didn't have a documentary. And I said to myself, this is a story that needs to be told. So I didn't ask him if I could do a documentary about him. I told him that I was going to do his documentary story, and that's kind of how our friendship began. And we embarked on working on this thing for 3 years before he passed away. And then it was a little tough when he passed away because I had dropped the project. And then a few years later, my wife passed away, and I dropped the project again. And so I just basically picked the project back up over the last 6 months. And we're fortunate that Ted Griggs over at Comcast Sportsnet had the faith that this would be some good programming for the station. And so here we are tomorrow night.
Oh, yeah, it's very exciting. I think that, people, should definitely tune in and see this and get this, this basketball history like you're alluding to. I guess when you're sitting down and having these conversations by a guy who is revered by, just the biggest names in the history of basketball, I guess what were some of the things that you, in talking with him really surprised you and that you go over in the documentary?
Well, I got a lot more surprises from the actual people that he wanted to tell his story. And it was like, the who's who of basketball. And so basically all the people that I interviewed, their life stories are interwoven in Pete Newell's story because, they genuinely talked about the impact that he had on their lives. And so when you're sitting down interviewing Pat Riley, and he's just opening up and telling you the impact that Pete Newell had on his career. Coach K. I get tongue-tied when I try to say Coach K.
Coach K. We all know Coach K.
Yeah, Coach K. Jerry Colangelo, Jerry West, on and on and on. I mean, it's just incredible. And so the people that take a chance to look at this documentary tomorrow night, they're going to learn a little bit, not only about Pete Newell, but about the impact that he had on all these great luminaries in professional and college basketball through his own story.
Yeah, and just when you go over and you look at these history and you try and go back and you talk about all the different ways that these different luminaries, like you said, it's kind of their lives are all interwoven with Newell's own story. How is it that maybe his name hasn't been discussed to the extent that it probably should have. I guess is there just a generational divide in terms of these guys? Like a Jerry West, Coach K. You look at like a Jerry Colangelo. These guys all know he was the guy, but then now you get the newer generation where they're just not as familiar.
I did a documentary called Bounce, and it was about Don Barksdale, and I interviewed Hall of Fame sports writer Leonard Coppett, and he said a line in that documentary that always sticks with me. He said, and history became nothing. Mm-hmm. The past doesn't count. And that's kind of like the mindset of a lot of young people. Once people take time out and really look at some of this historical material that they find is very fascinating and interesting, and they're actually learning something. And so, history is important, and it's just a matter of, sitting down and taking a look at it. One of the things that you'll find is that some of the greatest players in the NBA over the last decade, like LeBron James, Kobe Bryant, and a few others, they study history. Mm-hmm. These guys, they spend time looking at old films of Wilt Chamberlain and some of the other great, Oscar Robertson, Magic Johnson, or some of the other great players. And so they have a great understanding about, some of the players that came along before them and what they did to be so successful. And I think that that's a good tool, looking at how things were done in the past, how other generations played the sport, and then kind of take from that.
Yeah. And, again, we're talking to Doug Harris, who is director and producer for the documentary Basketball Guru, The Pete Newell Story, which is going to air on Comcast Sportsnet Bay Area immediately following the Warriors game tomorrow night against the Heat. But, it's funny because I talked to my dad about this stuff, and he knows the era very well, and he talks about, what a big deal, USF basketball was. And people don't, I guess because things have changed now, people don't realize just the extent to which, the impact that it had in the national game.
Yeah, well, you can also make an argument for Cal.
Yeah.
Pete Newell coached Cal to his first and only national championship, and there's a lot to be said about that, and for Bay Area basketball. So, when you're looking at winning basketball in the Bay Area, it all basically starts with Pete Newell. But one of the interesting things that I found about doing this documentary was the fact that what would basketball have been like, what would it be like had Pete Newell continued to coach? Pete Newell stopped coaching when he was 44 years old.
So, I guess did he talk? Did you glean from him why he decided to walk away?
Well, I didn't talk to him about why he decided to walk away, but that came out in the interviews with some of his players at Cal. Pete Newell was a perfectionist, and he was so wound up in the game he couldn't really eat, 2 or 3 days before the game, a day or two after. And so he was basically on a coffee and cigarette diet, and he was super wound up. And his doctors told him that if he continued to coach, that he would eventually kill himself. And so he stepped away from the game. Pete Newell's last game as a coach was the 1960 Olympic Championship game where the USA won the gold medal in 1960, which is considered one of the greatest amateur teams of all time. And so Pete Newell just became the guru. He stopped coaching, but he coached all the coaches. He taught all the coaches. So Pete Newell is probably the biggest contributor to the sport of basketball in the history of the game, and it's just incredible that I had the opportunity to produce his life story.
No, I'm really looking forward to watching this, and it's interesting to me, Doug. And again, we're talking to Doug Harris, director and producer of this documentary airing Wednesday night after the Warriors Heat game on Comcast Sportsnet Bay Area. Basketball Guru, the Pete Newell story, in which basketball, has changed from being a very systematic, coach-led sport to, the 80s and 90s where you did see great systems, but the emergence of the great talents, and you saw, the names take over the sport, whereas in the last 15, 20 years, especially with what we saw from the Jazz and the Spurs and now the Warriors, it's being heavily led by team success again. Is that something that you think you can trace back to the success and just the overall impact of a Pete Newell?
I think you really look at system and structures that have been put in place by a lot of the coaches, And if you look at some of Pete Newell's old game tapes and game films where there's a lot of off-ball screening, cutting action, that's a lot of the stuff that you're seeing today, different variations of what Pete Newell ran at Cal and USF called a system called reverse action. And, I look at basketball a little bit differently from most fans. I look at what's going on away from the ball. And I'm seeing a lot of some of the concepts that Pete Newell ran and made him such a successful coach and teacher being implemented in the game today. And it's really wonderful because, basketball isn't a sport where the great teams are successful by having one or two superstars, hogging the ball and handling the ball, and everybody else is just standing around. And I think that when you see offensive systems where people are moving and cutting away from the ball and the ball's being touched by everybody, then, everybody's involved, and you're seeing winning programs, winning teams really excel in the sport. And it's fun to watch.
Great stuff. Again, we were talking to Doug Harris right now, director and producer of the film, the documentary Basketball Guru, the Pete Newell story. One last question for you, Doug, and I'm curious about this because it seems like with every time you see an interview with Bobby Knight, you never know exactly what you're going to get, but he is unmistakably a student of the sport. I'm curious just about some of the things that he had to say.
Well, one of the things that Bobby Knight said about Pete Newell, and we used an excerpt of Pete Newell's induction to the San Diego Hall of Fame, which Bobby Knight was the presenter. And Bobby Knight made an interesting point in saying that there's a saying in basketball that the game has passed us up, meaning that the game has passed up us coaches. But he said, but the game has never passed Pete Newell up. And Pete Newell has been involved with basketball at the college and pro level for 7 decades. Not 2 or 3, 7.
That's unbelievable.
So that's an incredible testament to Pete Newell.
Doug, I'm stoked to watch this film, man. I am really excited to watch this, and we're out of time, but I thank you so much for coming on today, and I hope everybody else can remember to tune in right after the Warriors and Heat on Wednesday night. Comcast Sportsnet Bay Area. Watch this documentary, Basketball Guru, the Pete Newell story. Again, we've been talking to Doug Harris, director and producer for the documentary. Doug, thank you so much, man. I hope we can talk again soon, all right?
Okay, you guys keep up the great work over there at KNBR.
Hey, thank you so much, man. I appreciate the kind words. That is Doug Harris, everyone. He is the director and producer of the documentary Basketball Guru, the Pete Newell story. Again, airing roughly 8 o'clock Wednesday night, right after the Warriors take on the Miami Heat. We're going to take a break right now. I'm Ted Ramey. You're listening to the show. We'll be right back after this.